Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show which shines a light on the hitherto dark crevices of the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. Happy New Year to you, and welcome to what is going to be basically an overview of season 2 as we come to an end to that season. In doing so, I'd like to thank everybody who's taken part in the show. I've had some absolutely fantastic guests on the show. What I want to do for you today, listeners, is, if you haven't heard all of the episodes, just to give you a feel of what we've done over the last 10 episodes and the sort of people who we've had on the show. Absolutely top class guests. We started off with Andrew Lownie, and Andrew Lownie, as you may well know, is a world-class historian. Obviously was educated at, I say obviously, but as the top historians tend to be in the United Kingdom, educating the Russell Group. For Andrew, it was at Oxford, and then he went on to study various individuals and issues. And his great interest was, which I got out of him during the programme, was actually looking how the historical world mixes with the present world. And he's also orientated himself towards the secret world in as far as that's concerned, unravelling secrets. So what we had was that Andrew spoke at some depth, actually, about his last 2 major books, The Tracy King and The Mountbattens, and how he looked into those and how he delved into it and got the information about them. Some things are quite worrying in terms of what Andrew was able to do regarding Edward VII, the king who abdicated. He was able to find out, really, that Edward VII was a Nazi sympathiser at a time when the United Kingdom was at war with Germany. A worrying situation. More so, he was able to uncover the fact that he may well have had a pact with Hitler, which suggested that if Great Britain lost the war or came to peace with Germany, that he would be put back onto the throne as a Pétain type figure. So that is an absolutely interesting episode and should be heard of. And in terms of Lord Mountbatten, you could argue it's even darker in many ways for the way that the normal everyday person who may or may not be interested in the most highest situations in the land. But Lord Mountbatten, as we know, the last Viceroy of India and a member of the royal family, Andrew was basically able to uncover the fact. He's still working on uncovering it. In fact, I'm going to have him back on the show probably in the new season because he's going to court and has spent a hell of a lot of money in doing so to try and get the diaries, the public diaries of Lord Mountbatten, because within that, it is suggested, more than suggested, stated in fact, that Lord Mountbatten was known to the Navy, and he was First Sea Lord of the Navy, basically to be a paedophile, and that he was ordering young officers to get him young boys from which he could have pleasure. So this is just one of the elements that we discussed in that absolutely fantastic episode at the beginning of the new season. So if you missed it, please go back to it. It's available to you and listen to it. It was absolutely brilliant. I then made a volte-face, if you will, in many ways, and jumped into a different subject with Dr. Tracy Hopwood. She was absolutely fantastic. She is a prison doctor who has spent much of her life in the UK prisons of all categories, from Cat A, which is, for those who don't know the British prison system, the most serious offenders, to open prisons. So she's met everybody and treated many, many people. And basically, one of the elements that she wanted to bring to the fore was that drugs plays a massive part, drugs, and I should say alcohol abuse in general, plays a massive part in prison life. And potentially also the reason why people went to prison in the first place. So she was able to provide me with an understanding and provide you, the listening viewers, with an understanding of how that is the case. Again, it's one of those episodes that, you know, people think they know things about prisons and about how prisons function and about what the problems are in prisons. But I think once you listen to that episode and begin to understand how prisons work and the devilish situation in terms of abuse of drugs and alcohol, I think you get a better understanding from it. And I think that's what Tracy was able to do in the programme. And again, we touched on issues. We could have gone much deeper. And I did suggest that we could get Tracy back sometime in the near future. Another, and I'll connect the two together, another area that I wanted to look at was, what is drug abuse like on the actual street? What is it like in everyday life? And I had a fantastic guest on called Jill, if you will, a hard, I was going to say no soft edges, but that would be wrong to Jill, but a hard, inquisitive, powerful female who wanted to look at drug abuse and dealing with drug abusers and alcohol abusers from a perspective of reality. And she was out there on the streets as a drug, I guess you can call them, really. Well, she calls it a drug worker, but I guess in more lights, they're kind of the person who provides insight to people who want to get off drugs. And the first thing that Jill said, I mean, one of the most fantastic elements of that was that Jill said, what we need to understand is that there are people who simply like taking drugs. And those people you aren't going to help until they stop liking what they're doing, or they get to such a rock bottom situation that they do really want to change. They may still like it, because once an addict, always an addict, as she said, but the addiction is greater than the pleasure. So she explained how that kind of process functioned. And I found it fascinating in that episode. I mean, she filled an episode by herself, as all the other guests have done, fill the episode themselves. The three guests I've already spoken about. And actually, throughout this season, every guest has filled an episode and could fill more. So again, some of the things that she said are harrowing, and it would be of interest to anybody who had an interest in the way the world works. Now, the reason why it's connected to the secret world, as I said to Jill, is that, frankly, terrorists utilise drugs, not only in taking them. Some people actually take them to carry out their terrorist acts, and some of the 9/11 guys did that. But more importantly, terrorists use that as a way of funding their operations, because everything needs money. So the drugs game feeds into the terror game, so feeds into the secret world. But I think for society anyway, because obviously one of the angles I look at throughout my show is basically the geopolitical world. And the geopolitical world is orientated around abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse to some extent, but it's not seen as such a great issue. I mean, obviously it was back in the 1920s when they had the Volstead Act, and drinking in the United States was illegal. So the Volstead Act is the Prohibition Act they had then. But since then, since it's been legal in most countries, and I mention in most countries because obviously if you live in Saudi Arabia, it's still illegal. And the Saudi Arabians, example, put out Interpol red notices for people who bring alcohol in the country in the same way as we would put out Interpol red notices of arrest. Those are notices of arrest for arrest internationally for people who bring drugs importers. So that's how it's perceived in some other parts of the world. So we shouldn't only be Euro or Western centric. We should look how other people see alcohol as well as those who see drugs. So one of the interesting things was, though, within that discussion, Jill and I started to speak about how class is a factor in terms of drug taking, and perceived wealth is a factor in terms of drug taking. So it only becomes a problem, really, for many in society when that drug taking is done by lower class individuals or individuals without the money who need to carry out some types of crime or sell their drugs in order to feed their habit. If you can afford your habit, and we mentioned people, we even spoke about within that episode how most of the people who went, and this is from their saying, not me saying it, they actually said it, when the Tory party, that's the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, had an electoral process to choose a new leader, practically everybody who put forward for that process admitted to taking drugs. Some of them said lower drugs, but some of them were taking Class A drugs, cocaine. And some people in government today have admitted saying, we have taken Class A drugs. And there is suspicion by many that some still do. Now, that's an allegation, and I can't say whether that's true or false. But what we do know is that that is something that has been propagated by many to suggest that the middle classes and the upper class, in fact, government itself has just said and came out about 4 weeks ago, that they're going to take, 3 weeks ago, that they're going to take some action against the middle classes who take drugs at the weekends, as they put it. Jill suggests that there isn't really weekend drug takers. She kind of suggests that the drug takers are drug takers. They may be proportioned out differently, but they are drug takers and hence abusers and hence addicts. So it's a fantastic subject. So we're looking at it, even government's been involved in it. People running the government are involved in taking drugs, but yet still the people being captured and caught and being policed, if you will. The policing processes go towards the lower classes. So that's an interesting issue in itself, and one that we touched on during that discussion, and the harms that are brought about and the fact that it can lead to prostitution and so on and so forth. Mind you, we did stress that prostitution isn't only those people who want to take drugs. No, we don't make it that simplistic. We are about, as you know on the show, we're about not seeing the simplicity in things. We're about looking at things from all angles, and this is another one of those fantastic episodes that does that. We kind of moved away from that, and I looked at other issues. So Black History Month came around and I looked at issues of blackness sometime after Black History Month. I spoke with actor Winston Ellis, who you may know from the Pirates of the Caribbean, in which he starred in there. But what I didn't know is how he got that role, nor did I know, somewhat parallel to myself, because I was also a kung fu man, that this guy was 3 times world martial arts champion, and it's an absolutely fantastic story. So you really must listen to the episode. You cannot not listen to this episode. How a guy moves into basically doing at least, I think he said around about 60 movies in Hong Kong as a top Hong Kong actor, working with Jackie Chan, Jet Li, so on and so forth, in these kung fu action movies, which he was doing. And he was a well-known star in the Far East. And for those people who watched kung fu movies, as I did at that stage as well. So he also mentions how Sir Roger Moore was the one who got him into working on what one would call Western movies, and enticed him back to the West, because he was living in Hong Kong, of course, making the movies, enticed him back to the West to take on Western movies. His story is fascinating. We talk about his life in Britain, how he grew up, what his chances were, his life chances, how stating he wanted to be an actor, or he fell into acting, something which was unheard of for a black person in many ways, in the United Kingdom, and how he went forward from that. It's a fascinating story. And again, I would suggest that anybody who wishes to have an understanding of what life was like in that period of time. He's 10 years younger than me, so you're looking at these 80s, 70s, growing up 80s and moving through what it was like and how he was perceived and how he then found his way through the discipline that Kung Fu gave him, and then the struggle to become an actor in other than Kung Fu movies in the West, within the British scene, and the fact that many other guys who wished to do that had to move to the States, contemporaries of his who did that and later became, well, you could argue more successful than him, who went to the States whereas he stayed in Britain. A fascinating episode. I also spoke to Dids Hall, and Dids Hall is an author, like myself, but a fiction author rather than somebody who's actually produced a memoir. And Dids basically, from being an author, moved into being an armourer. Kind of a strange move, but I think he wanted to find the authentication when he was talking about firearms. He wanted to understand that authentication, say, this is how it works in terms of firearms. What happens when I rack a weapon back? And he went from that, he'd had some experience with weapons before, but he went from that to understanding weapons to then being an armourer in another country. So, he's got a lot of connection with police and military and stuff like that. And we'd speak about the arming of the British police and what he thinks about that. And it was also at the time when Alec Baldwin had shot the producer, and he had worked on movies as an armourer as well, Dids. So to me, it was a great opportunity to speak about that. How in God's name could an actor shoot somebody on set when the first thing you learn in firearms is what is a hot weapon, i.e. loading, and what's cold? And you learn also never to point a weapon at somebody unless you want to pull the trigger. And secondly, that prior to that, you always make sure that the weapon, regardless of whoever says what to you when they hand it to you, you always make sure that the weapon is empty, i.e. there is not a round in the weapon if you're going to pull a trigger towards somebody. So it, to me, was amazing that on a movie set, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes. Okay, sometimes it's a, let's say, a $10 million movie, but I know the ones Alec Baldwin's generally are like definitely, 20, 30, 40, $50 million movies. And so you've got some of the best people, best armourers, best producers, all there trying to make sure that everything's set up correctly. For such a mistake to be made was, for me, an amazing situation. So I was discussing with Dids how that could happen. Now, Dids and I differ on some factors. I'm for arming the British police all the time because I believe that once you are called to the scene of an event, you have to have all the capabilities to protect yourself and the members of the public you are there to assist. And if you haven't got a firearm, as 94% of British police don't, probably even 98% if you're outside of London, then a person with a knife is a threat to you. The person with a knife can damage you more than you can save yourself and save the public and damage them. So you're no better than a member of the public, to my mind. Dids' position was that the citizens should, if they so wish, have firearms. I'm totally and utterly against that. I'm against that American type situation. I'm only for the police having that and for them to be well trained, and I believe they would be, and for them to be, how should I put it, absolutely and totally responsible for their acts. So if you were to shoot somebody as a police officer, and I carried throughout my career I would say throughout my career I carried a firearm, and I was utterly and totally understanding of the fact that if I shot someone, I would end up in front of a court. Now, I would hope that if I shot somebody responsibly, that I would then be perceived as doing the job correctly. But if I was in some way wanton or some way reckless, then I deserve to have the problem that I might have. I've been all over the world with my guys, carrying weapons all over the world, and I made my guys and I be very, very clear what we were doing with our weapons. We were in war zones, we were in Afghanistan, we were in Iraq, we were in Somalia, we were in Colombia, we were all over the place. And never have I said, be loose with your weapons trade. No, you always kept your weapons trade and tradecraft correct. Taking a life or even shooting somebody without taking a life is not something that one should do without ever thinking about it. So it was always something that I believed that is a last resort. But you have to have the capacity to defend the public. And if you can't defend the public because you can't defend yourself, you have a situation where people die. And that has happened on many, many, many occasions in Britain. Because the police don't have what's required, people have died. Now, that's hidden. And this story's about, if you will, putting a light on hidden things. Many occasions, because police are not carrying and have to wait for other police that do, in some places that's very, very few and far between, and miles away, the police are there, put a cordon in, but can't do anything to protect the individuals. And that can't be right. Because at the end of the day, you call a police officer to be able to deal with the issues that come in front of them. And worse still, because we have some of the best command and control systems in the world, CCTV everywhere. Now we can argue whether having CCTV everywhere is a good thing or a bad thing, but we have it, and this allows us a great degree of command and control. We can get people to issues very, very quickly. We can see what's going on very, very quickly. We can orientate how our actions can be very, very quickly. But then we have nobody with a simple kit to be able to surround, bring to surrender, or, if necessary, stop individuals who are hampering and killing the public. And that is not good enough. It just simply isn't. So that was my argument, and Dids agreed with that, but he wanted to take it a step further. So that was a discussion that we were having. So it's an interesting discussion. Again, one that I think that if you've got any interest at all in this secret world, the world of policing, the world of intelligence agencies, etc., it's something that I'm sure you would all wish to hear. Another very, very interesting programme which I had was with a guy called Carl. I just say his first name because he provided me with the first name. And I know who he is, but obviously I didn't utilise his second one. He was in the gaming industry. He calls it the gaming industry. To me and you, it's gambling. And he went from, his father had a gambling company and he fell into that company. But prior to that, he'd also been things like a croupier. And I learned some absolutely interesting areas. Now, why is that something that's of interest to the secret world? Well, dead simple, because in terms of money laundering, you can't find a much better way than doing it in a gambling establishment. And we touched on how that might have happened, allegedly happened, with President Trump when he was working on building one of his establishments in Atlantic City in the US. I mean, if you want to look that up, you can read and look it up and find out about it. We kind of discussed that, and we discussed how money laundering is a process in the secret world. But also, it's just a thing of interest. Gambling on everything has expanded unbelievably. And Carl, who's made a very good living out of it, and he says, and he also said to anybody who was listening, frankly, there's only one way to win, and that way to win is to keep your money in your pocket. Or, and he was truthful about it, be in cahoots if you're on a gambling, let's say on a roulette board, with people who are actually working the system. But then you have to be in cahoots with not only one, but two. And he explains that, and if you listen, you'll understand how that happens. But basically what he's saying is you can't win. And he explains that. But his fear is that it's mushroomed out of control. That, you've got men and women gambling, men on football, let's argue, could be women on football as well, but primarily men on football, on everything to do with football. Things that lend themselves to actually corrupt the game of football or cricket or whatever it might be because of the ease of what you can gamble on. You can gamble on the first corner. You can gamble on a fellow being out for a duck. You can gamble on whatever. Now, obviously, that lends itself to corrupt elements. But he also said, just as distressing, you get the situation with what seems to be predominantly women playing, is these bingo games and things like that, which you just play. Again, you can't win. He explained how you can have things that would appear to be just basic, like slot machines, some that ask questions, but they're all set up for you to lose. And he explained how that is something that you won't change. You frankly won't win. Indeed, he gave what I thought was a fantastic example where he said that on one day he was changing some of his machines around and this fella came into one of the, and I think it was in a bookies where he had several different machines and he had various machines in many different bookies all over the place. And for those who are not in Britain, a bookies is a gambling establishment where you can gamble on horse riding, but they also have other issues and they have slot machines. And he said he was in one changing things around and a fella came in, put his money in and won £400. What would that be? $600 or something like that, US dollars. And the guy said to him, "Oh, I bet you hate that, don't you?" And he said, "No, I love it." He said, "What do you mean you love it?" He said, "Because that guy's hooked. He'll be back. And what he will do is he'll spend his money trying to achieve this victory again, and he won't achieve it. So he's hooked now for life." And he realised that. But what Carl did say is anybody who wanted to contact him, and he left his email and basically said, "If you want to contact me because you've got a problem gambling, please do." You know, he wanted to give something back to those who may have a problem in the gambling game, those who have fallen foul to the slick advertising and how it's done about the gambling situation now, which basically tries to suggest to you that gambling isn't gambling. It's, in a way, I guess, like we've been able to say that a mortgage isn't a debt. The banks have played on that. Oh, mortgage isn't a debt. Get yourself a mortgage. Get the highest mortgage you can. It's as though it's not a debt. Well, it is a debt if house prices go down. So it's the same with gambling now. They basically say, "Oh, gamble cleverly. Don't go beyond your limit. Don't do." At the same time, they're pumping out opportunities time and time and time again. And he sees this as ultra, ultra dangerous, particularly when it's worked in cahoots with the internet, because then there's nobody slowing you down. And more importantly, as he puts it, and you've got to listen to the episode. I mean, I'm just touching the sides of this issue. But he's basically saying that if you gamble in this way, because you're not actually giving your money over, and that was, by the way, as he explains, the whole idea of having tokens rather than money. Because you're not giving your money over, it doesn't appear as though you're gambling. So you're a lady or a man sitting there, lady on, I don't know, let's say on some bingo thing, and the guy on some football thing. You're not specifically putting your money over. It isn't happening because you're not physically handing it. But the fact that you're not physically handing it over makes it much more easy to gamble. You see, that's the whole point. So it's quite an interesting process. And yeah, I was discussing that with him in that episode. So please do try and listen to that episode. I think it's a brilliant episode. I then thought that what I would do, because I kind of, in the next episode, I kind of understood that there was a disconnect. Let's put it that way. There was a disconnect between how people perceived, oftentimes non-white, but people who you could argue were originally not born in the United Kingdom, and people who were of the United Kingdom but not born here. So what I mean by that is, you find a lot of people, particularly now, they say, "Oh, we don't want Asian people, we don't want black people, we don't want whatever, get them out, get them back from whence they came." But those same people, and oftentimes, not always in older age groups, are very happy about the empire. They say, "Oh, the empire's fantastic. You know, we had the empire, we're the greatest in the world, we sold our goods all over the world, etc., etc." And what I wanted to do was show how that really functioned. So I was able to get together several 95-year-olds and 90-year-olds and speak to them about the empire. So they happened to come from the Caribbean, but it could have been from somewhere else, but on this occasion it was the Caribbean. And basically, they were from places that were already British 400 years ago. The British had taken over those islands, first for slave trade and then thereafter, 400 years ago. And the people were brought up knowing everything about Britain, were educated as if they were in a British school, knew about Lord Nelson and about all of the British heroes, but knew nothing about the Caribbean, because that's not what they were taught in the schools. They were only taught Britishness. And when it came to Britain's wars, they all joined in because the empire was at war. And basically these people saw Britain as the mother country. So whenever Britain was in trouble, these people were there to help and assist. So their husbands, because they were women, because their husbands had died, their husbands had been in the war, in fact, had been in the merchant navy or in the army, had fought for Britain. And when they were then asked post-war, the men had been here before, asked post-war, do they want to come to Britain to aid? And these happened to be nurses, some of these women. They say, yeah, we'll come over to the mother country to help. That was their belief. Now, even though in the countries, Barbados, Trinidad, whatever, there was a quasi-apartheid system where the whites of British heritage, or heritage from Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales, had a better way of living, basically like apartheid. So they could do more and were allowed to do more than the blacks were. And obviously there were many mixed-race people who could do more than the blacks could do. So the way it worked was just like in South Africa. There is no difference really. Only the fact they didn't have passes. But if you were a black person, you could only go certain places. If you were a white person, you could go everywhere. If you're a white person, you generally didn't work. You had the blacks working for you, etc., etc., etc. That's the system they had. So even though they had that system, their belief was somehow that we're all in it together. So they were surprised when they came to Britain that the average English person didn't see them as British, because they'd always been told that that was their homeland. You know, for 400 years, their ancestors had been told that. And so it was a strange thing. And it's great to hear how these ladies explain that process like it's a given. Like, of course we came to assist. Of course our men fought in the war. Why wouldn't we? Our country was being attacked. I mean, just a given. You never see that in Britain. You never have that understanding in Britain. It's as though some foreigners have come across from the Caribbean, and these foreigners have come here taking our jobs, when indeed they're told you're supported. And indeed all of the labour that they produced back in the Caribbean was all going to the United Kingdom anyway. And that's exactly the same for anywhere in empire. That's the same for the one for a better word, the coloured empire. Obviously, the dominions, as they were called, were treated somewhat differently, because that's where white people tended to be. Yes, the people they were ruling were people of colour, but they tended to be, and sometimes the populations were greater of white, ex-white British than the people of colour British. So I'm thinking of Canada, I'm thinking of New Zealand as it began, Australia. Later on, those people of white heritage became indigenous, if you will, rather than the others. So they were treated differently. But as a general rule, these people were perceived to provide for Britain. So it was a vast... Funny enough, we come back to Andrew Lownie, because we talked about that in the first episode with Andrew, how, frankly, the system soaked out everything from empire and soaked it into Britain, and then spewed it all back into the empire, having only come from Britain. So you see, that's how you have Indians who fought valiantly First, Second World Wars, how the Indians lost 3 million people in that war, and in Great Britain we lost 450,000. The context is never given to the British people, that these people were fighting for us, and these people were fighting and dying for us, or they died of starvation for us because we took the food back to Great Britain. So these are the issues which they didn't quite understand, why the British people didn't like them or weren't friendly towards them. So that's a great... If you have opportunity, as I say, with all the opportunities, please listen to it and you'll get and understand. It is in no way some sort of mourning process by these people. It's more a process of bewilderment. Why don't people understand that? Listen to it. Gives you a better understanding of history. Then there's one, I came more into the secret world again. I wanted to end the season basically on the secret world. So I had the great opportunity to get to John Weir. Now, John is a great guy. He is for want of a better word, an extremely well-known veteran reporter, publisher, producer. He's Mr. Investigative journalism. If you knew, as I did in the early 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and you have World in Action, John Weir was a guy that was on World in Action. He was one of the presenters. He was a guy who often presented from Northern Ireland, what was going on, how things were affecting the Northern Irish people as well as British soldiers that were there, and how the whole situation was working. So he then moved across from the investigative journalism of World in Action to the BBC and Panorama. And that's where you probably know about him, because for the last 30 odd years he's been doing Panorama, and he is a major, major player within Panorama, which is BBC's flagship programme that's about geopolitics. And he's been on that forever and a day. So it was an absolutely a great honour and an absolutely very, very interesting situation about how the secret world was functioning in what we euphemistically call the Troubles, anywhere else you'd say the Civil War in Northern Ireland, and how that functioned, what the IUC Special Branch, as he saw it, were doing. Obviously I saw it from a different perspective, but he saw it from his perspective as a reporter, and how that all functioned. So, frankly, if you are listening to my programme, the Black Spy Podcast, because you are interested in the secret world, you must listen to John's episode. And within that episode, we also touched on Spycatcher, world famous book, which I guess everybody who is into and interested in this world would know about, where Peter Wright, who was a Deputy Director of Security Service, was one of the first people to actually move away and write a memoir about the Security Service. Frankly, because he didn't feel he was getting his full pension. But that's how it started, incredible. The British government took him to court in Australia, because that's where he ran off to. John was fundamental in Australia in dealing with Peter Wright and getting the story out. And his recollections are fantastic. His recollections of who then subsequently became, because he was Peter Wright's lawyer, but who subsequently became the Prime Minister of Australia. His recollections of that is great too, about how he met him, how they spoke. He actually even mimics the voice of the former Prime Minister of Australia, which I thought was fantastic. And he explains how that whole process worked and how he didn't actually fully believe Peter. He wondered if Peter was over-egging the situation about spies within MI5, better known real name, the Security Service. But how Peter was saying, oh, this guy was a spy and that guy was a spy. And how he believed that the whole of the British ruling elite apparently seemed to be in some ways potentially have been taken over by the Soviet Union. So it's an interesting programme, and we touched on many, many things in that programme, many secret things which you wouldn't hear anywhere else. And finally, my last two episodes of this season are, if you are in the secret world whatsoever and want an understanding of the secret world whatsoever, want an understanding of how Britain has been particularly secretive, then you needed to listen to the last two episodes which I've put forward. And those are by a good friend of mine, Bob Pugh, who with me was in the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, which, as you know, is headquartered by Scotland Yard, so Scotland Yard Special Branch, and how we had the national responsibility for fighting the IRA and for dealing with many, many issues, and also in terms of national responsibility for protection, for police explanation of processes. An organisation that was formed in 1883 to carry out this role, the first security service in the United Kingdom, and that this was the service that Bob Pugh and I were part of, and its whole ethos. And we explain how at one stage it was extremely secretive, and how, for all intents and purposes, it was Britain's secret police, and how he functioned within that, and how we functioned within it. The process of actually joining the branch we speak about. We speak about his work within as head of the surveillance units of the branch, and that there were several surveillance teams that he was responsible for, and the jobs and the roles that they took on. We also speak about his role, which he undertook because he was on the Prime Minister's protection team, one of the senior officers on that, and how he ran that. So we speak about that and about what it's like. Throughout these two episodes, if you've got any interest whatsoever in the secret world, you must, I repeat, must listen to Bob Pugh's two episodes. And I couldn't put it into one. I tried, but it's just too big, and I couldn't leave it halfway through. So I basically put two episodes together regarding Bob. As with many of the others, I frankly think I've just touched on, the surface of what these guys and gals have done, because all of them are unique, special, and frankly extremely capable individuals whom I would hope I would have back on the show in the future, be it in the next season coming, season 3, or season 4 thereafter. So listen, ladies and gents, listeners, thank you very, very much. This is just an overview so you can get an idea of what you might have missed, what you might wish to go back to. Obviously, as always, all of my episodes are available. They will never go away. So please join, listen to the show, and get a view of the world you live in from the people who actually live in parts of that world that you'll never know. I mean, the fact is, we are an extremely interdependent species now. We very rarely do everything ourselves. And so it's worthwhile knowing how others function and what that means for you. You know, what are you missing out on? This lifts that lid on the things you're missing out on. It explains to you how that world really works, and in particular the secret world, which you'll never see anywhere else or never hear of anywhere else, how that functions, and the allied tasks that come with it, and tasks that where the connections are, you might not know they're there, but they are there, and how you can get an understanding of this world you live in. So all I can say is thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you in season 3. Thank you for all those who have supported me throughout. Have a happy new year, 2022 now, and I'll see you next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.